The answer is oil. Saudi Arabia became rich because of its immense oil reserves. At the beginning of the 20th century, Abdulaziz Al Saud, often known as Ibn Saud, began a series of conquests in the Arabian Peninsula. The conquered territories, which cover most of the peninsula, form the territory of modern Saudi Arabia. The Saudi kingdom, the only country named after a family, was recognized as a sovereign state by the early 1930s. However, the newly founded state was extremely poor. While Saudi Arabia is a large country by global standards, almost all of it, with the exception of a small southwestern region, is desert. The population in the 1930s was largely illiterate and lived a pastoral, nomadic way of life. The sole source of income for the Saudi royal family came from taxes imposed on pilgrims visiting Mecca and Medina. This income was small and highly volatile. After the Great Depression hit, the number of pilgrims plummeted from an average of 100,000 per year to just 40,000, deepening the financial difficulties the kingdom faced. At times, the Saudi family's coffers reached lows of only a few $1,000s, and the per capita GDP was smaller than that of many African countries. The discovery of oil in Persia in 1908, followed by findings in Iraq, sparked hopes that the Arabian Peninsula might also hold this precious reserve. However, the general consensus among researchers at the time was that there was no oil in the Arab Peninsula. This didn't stop Ibn Saud from looking. He met Frank Holmes in 1922, a mining engineer who began the search for oil in the eastern region. Later, the king also sent Karl Twitchell to examine eastern Saudi Arabia, where he found promising signs: asphalt seeps in the vicinity of Qatif. The first discovery of oil in Bahrain in 1932 further encouraged the king to pursue the resource on the Saudi territory. 6 years later, the California Arabian Standard Oil Company, a subsidiary of Standard Oil of California, first struck oil at the Dammam No. 7 site. In the following years, many other sites would strike oil, and the fate of Saudi Arabia would change radically. The Persian Gulf region holds the biggest oil reserves in the world. Also, the oil that Saudi Arabia possesses is of a high-quality light crude. This means it requires less refining compared to other sources of oil, such as Venezuela's heavier crude. The reserves are mostly close to the surface. As a result, the cost of extracting the oil is very low, often in the single digits per barrel. This is a massive advantage. When the oil price drops to the point that most oil fields around the world run at a loss, Saudi Arabia's oil still brings a profit. Just 1 year after the discovery, the first tanker loaded with Saudi crude oil, the DG Schofield, sailed from the newly constructed port of Ras Tanura. King Abdulaziz personally turned the valve to fill the tanker. However, the outbreak of World War II in 1939 greatly slowed the initial development and commercial export of oil. While the new revenue was significant for the Saudi monarchy, the full-scale industrial build-up was delayed until the war's end. In 1944, the California Arabian Standard Oil Company was renamed the Arabian American Oil Company, a name hinting at the future strategic importance of Saudi Arabia to American interests in the region. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz Ibn Saud met on February 14, 1945, in what became one of the most important diplomatic encounters of the 20th century. The meeting took place aboard the US Navy heavy cruiser USS Quincy in the Great Bitter Lake of the Suez Canal as Roosevelt was returning from the Yalta Conference. This meeting laid the foundation for the strategic and largely transactional alliance between the US and Saudi Arabia. In short, the long-term agreement can be summarized as oil for security. The main goal for the US was securing an American sphere of influence over the vital resource. The US was concerned about its domestic oil reserves being depleted. Saudi Arabia, where the US company Aramco had exclusive exploration rights, was already known to have the world's largest oil reserves. The US wanted to ensure that its chief rivals and even its allies would not gain control over the region's oil, which was strategically vital for the post-war global economy. The king also approved the US's request to build the Dhahran airfield, providing an important facility and logistical base for US operations in the region. Saudi Arabia, a strategically vulnerable kingdom, sought protection and stability. The guarantee of US protection was viewed by the king as essential for the survival of his new nation against external threats, particularly from regional rivals. Guaranteed oil purchases by the world's emerging superpower and its allies would ensure a steady and massive stream of revenue, transforming the nation's economic fortunes. Access to American expertise, technology, and aid was necessary for developing its oil industry and modernizing the country. The end of World War II dramatically accelerated Saudi Arabia's transformation. The colossal demand for cheap energy to fuel the rebuilding of Europe and the expansion of the US economy triggered a massive increase in oil production. Saudi Arabia's oil output quickly skyrocketed from around 500,000 barrels per day in 1949 to over 10 million barrels per day in the late 1970s. This spectacular growth, coupled with a landmark 50-50 profit-sharing agreement with Aramco, a process that culminated in full nationalization decades later, channeled colossal revenues directly into the state's coffers. This newfound wealth fundamentally changed Saudi society. The traditional pastoral and nomadic way of life quickly faded. The government invested heavily in infrastructure and modern services, schools, hospitals, and subsidized housing, which encouraged the population to settle in cities, leading to rapid urbanization and a more sedentary lifestyle. The rapid industrial and infrastructural buildup created a massive need for a workforce, a demand the small, largely unskilled Saudi population could not meet. This led to a huge migrant wave, broadly split into two distinct groups. Highly skilled workers, engineers, managers, and doctors were necessary to run the complex oil industry and administration. But the vast majority were low-skilled laborers from other Arab countries, South Asia and Southeast Asia, hired for physically demanding and service sector jobs in construction and domestic service. The Saudi leadership used the oil wealth not just for infrastructure, but as a means of social control and wealth distribution. The state became the primary employer of the local population, with a significant portion of the oil income channeled through public sector jobs. Many of these well-paid government positions were often fictive or functionally redundant, essentially operating as a social program to spread the oil wealth and secure the population's loyalty. Italian philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli believed that states established in fertile areas might become complacent and weak. The abundance of resources can lead to a lack of discipline and a sense of entitlement among the populace. He believed that without strict laws and governance, the natural advantages of such regions could foster laziness and dependency. Good governance is crucial in maintaining order and ensuring that the benefits of a fertile region do not lead to societal decay. Thus, Machiavelli emphasized the need for rulers to implement strong laws to counteract the potential negative effects of prosperity. Drawing on the warning from Machiavelli, the Saudi leaders' policy inadvertently bred a culture of entitlement. The Saudi population grew comfortable and began to view employment in services, manual labor, and certain private sector jobs as suitable only for foreigners. This labor market segmentation, where Saudis overwhelmingly prefer the public sector and migrants feel the private sector, has created a deeply entrenched economic issue that continues to complicate the push for diversification and reform today. The massive oil revenues that flowed into Saudi Arabia transformed its wealth, but they came at the cost of creating a mono-economy, a state entirely dependent on a single resource. This dependence is the root of the Petro-Economy problem, which represents a major risk for the kingdom. The primary risk is inherent in the nature of oil itself, price volatility. As with most other commodities, the price of crude oil is dictated by unpredictable global factors, causing the revenues the Saudi state can draw to swing widely from year to year. A high oil price can bring a period of unprecedented fortune, financing infrastructure projects and generous social spending. But a sudden drop in price can devastate the state's finances, triggering deficits and economic instability. A partial solution to this risk is fiscal discipline. In good years, when prices are high and revenues flood in, the state saves a large portion in vast sovereign wealth funds and reserves, meant to act as a buffer during bad years. However, this is only a partial solution because long-term oil price prediction is impossible. No one can know if the next period of low prices will be a temporary dip or a prolonged slump that could ultimately deplete a state's monetary reserves. As an absolute monarchy, the management of the state's finances has historically depended heavily on the personality of the ruling monarch. While wise rulers ensured their country's finances were well ordered, irresponsible ones occasionally used the national wealth without sound judgment, triggering periods of instability through overspending and bad investments. This reality is perfectly illustrated by the reigns of the first two sons of the kingdom's founder. King Saud bin Abdulaziz Al Saud is widely regarded as the financially irresponsible monarch whose extravagant personal spending and poorly judged fiscal policies drove the kingdom to the brink of bankruptcy despite rapidly increasing oil revenues. Saud embarked on a massive spending spree, notably commissioning the construction of an enormous and opulent royal residence on the outskirts of Riyadh at a staggering cost. Much of the state's wealth was treated as the king's personal treasury, funding lavish royal palaces and gifts. The combination of this out-of-control spending and an inefficient bureaucracy led to the kingdom accumulating substantial national debt and serious budgetary deficits in the late 1950s. By 1958, the state was so financially weak that the royal family and religious leaders feared the state collapse. This financial crisis ultimately led to a power struggle within the House of Saud. King Faisal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, who served as prime minister and crown prince before formally replacing his brother, is credited with being the financially wise and reforming monarch who saved the country's finances. Faisal was first appointed as prime minister in 1958 specifically to address the financial crisis created by his brother. He immediately implemented drastic austerity measures and budget cuts to stop the hemorrhaging of funds and rescue the treasury from its massive debt. He worked to stabilize the kingdom's bureaucracy and imposed more control over state spending, formally separating the royal family's personal finances from state budget. After formally ascending to the throne, Faisal laid the foundation for modern economic planning by inaugurating the country's first 5-year plan for economic development in 1970. This move introduced a structured, long-term approach to spending, marking a fundamental shift away from the erratic, personalized spending of the past. The contrast between the two brothers led to the King Saud's eventually forced abdication in 1964. But as decades passed, one thing became clearer. Oil is not forever. One day, either the last drop of oil will be brought to the surface, or the world will turn away from oil and use other energy sources. Thus, the kingdom must reform its economy away from oil, a task of formidable difficulty that Saudi Arabia has not yet fully achieved, despite significant efforts. Saudi Arabia's efforts to escape the dependency on oil is another fascinating subject for which I dedicated a different video. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Please give it a like and subscribe to my channel for more interesting stories. I'll see you in the next video.